So we are here again Sunday morning and Sunday the 21st of May, ready to talk about the mental obsession and also emotional sobriety, given that drinking, drug use, any compulsion we pursue is a suicidal tendency. None of it is ever healthy for us. They're all examples of wanting to try to kill the self that we think we are, in the name of not wanting to let go of the thinking that causes us to believe who we are is all we think, or that all we think is who we are. And emotional sobriety, just like sobriety for anyone who has a compulsive addictive tendency in any regard, with any symptom, is insane to continue to do those things. And emotional sobriety is about sane living. It's about beginning to consider things accurately enough to be relied on, because if anything is true, once you recognize that, you never have to think about it again, because it will always be applicable. It'll always be usable. It'll always be functional. It'll always be easy because it doesn't take any aerobic exercise or acrobatics to get there. We don't have to go on to a major mental bender to arrive, because it becomes apparent that we're already where we've always been. We're always where we are. We're always with everything else and everyone else simultaneously to our own experience right now. And to take that a step further, we've got a couple of new, Fed and Sam. To take that a step further is to mention that nothing ever happens at any other time than the present. So we're always in the present. And when we think we're not in the present, it's only thinking that we're not in the present that we're doing while we're in the present thinking that. So if you entertain that concept and start to just live with that a little bit and start to allow it to sort of float in your head, you'll start to notice that wherever you're ever thinking about it, you're always where you are, exactly where you are. And so too is everything else. So the occurrence of it starts as you consider. Consideration isn't agreement. It isn't faith, belief, hope, trust. It's simply saying maybe, possibly. Being open rather than absolutely not, can't be, I don't get it, it's over. It's just being willing to consider things. Now, my experience is I had been willing my whole life not to consider anything but what I thought, thinking that someday I could reinforce and insist that everyone finally come to terms with what I was thinking so that I could create what I thought was reality, when in fact what it was doing was disrupting all of my interactive capacity with everyone that I knew and everything that I interacted with.
Do you ever do that still?
Sure. Every day. Every day. The difference here is this isn't about not doing it, it's about seeing it for what it is. It's kind of like if you walked into a wall thinking it wasn't there and finally decided it was there, the chances are you wouldn't walk into it anymore. It isn't that the wall goes away, it's that our thinking about it becomes obvious. Rather than acting oblivious, we start actually operating in relation to it and saying, oh, that's just another thought. I can antagonize the thought. I can react to the thought, I can fight the thought, I can oppose the thought, or I can simply concede I'm having a thought. And when I concede anything accurately as things are, they disappear because there is no opposition. When I oppose something, I'm thinking it shouldn't be what it is, and while I'm in the present, everything that's happening is exactly what it is, where it is, how it is now. So for me to start a fight with how things are is to live in a constant state of terror and fear and dread, because things are always as they are, not as I think that they are, until I begin to concede that they are as they are, how they are, when they are now. They're just as they are. So we are free. Application in this is the confirmation. As you begin to apply thoughts, consider them, live with them, see how they fit. You'll start to see if they have any basis for you. You may see them in other words than I use, but you'll start seeing how they function in your own experience in ways that seem almost laughable to think that you weren't capable of for all the time you spent thinking that somehow your thinking would solve the problem that it was creating.
I was trying to think of a real world example too for this. And then I'm like, what am I feeling right now? Because I'm supposed to go out to dinner with some people in a little bit. So they're asking me, texting me as we're here, like, what time are we meeting at? And I said, well, I'm on this meeting right now. And then like, well, what time is it over at? And I said 7:30, which is this time. And they said, okay, so we'll meet at 7. So it's just the process of and I'm kind of just want to say, you know what, I really just want to do this meeting. Let's go out a different night. And then so I'm thinking, like, are they going to be really upset? And why am I trying to get out of going to dinner with them? Should I, that's where instead of just like, that's the uncertainty. I guess that's where the mental obsession comes in, where you're not really sure what's going to happen yet. You're still trying to plan out some stuff.
Let me assure you of what's going to happen.
What?
What's going to happen? I mean, there are absolute ways we can be confident with everything that's going on if we simply get off the debate stage and start letting things just be what they are. And it becomes kind of obvious that everything has always happened the way it happened. And it never happened because I thought it should happen, or I wished it would happen, or I wanted it to happen. It happened exactly as it happened because it happened as it happened, period. So if my expectation is that if I think my thoughts are so true and real that the only thing that should ever happen, which is how expectations of this sort are created, when I think my thinking is true and real, I think all that should ever happen is what I expect. What I expected would happen when I had that thought to begin with. And the chances are, my experience is, almost never has the thing I originally thought of happened the way I thought it would happen.
Well, just part of the funny part is they said, okay, so what time is the meeting over? And I said earlier than it really is because it's 6:30 right now. So I said 7:30. She said, okay, great. Well, we'll meet at 7 then. So I think that's a mistype. But then I wonder, like, who would say something like that if they say, what time is the meeting over? And you say,
apparently the woman who said it would say something like that.
But that's the mental obsession. It's like, now, why is she totally wrong? Is that really the way?
I wouldn't want to go to dinner with her either. She sounds like a control freak, Anthony. That's really
It's Marie. It's Marie.
So.
Oh, then you know exactly why she said it.
You are totally right.
That was not a typo.
So focusing, Anthony,
What?
Rather than distracting with circumstances that the immediacy of what you're doing with what you're doing is the cause of what's causing whatever's happening in your experience.
But that's just a mental obsession. If you have mental obsession, like you can obsess over it. Just going to dinner is like, where are we going? What time? Where are we sitting? Is that the right? Just everything is a mental obsession. Where would you park? Did you park in the right spot?
Everything is only a mental obsession to those obsessed with their mentality. Those things don't have any mentality at all. Those things are just things doing what things do. We give that and imbue that because we want a discount.
Oh my God. This is only funny because I brought it up last week. Of course, what does she say? She says, are you paying for everybody tonight? Because she's taking a couple of friends, It's that same stuff again. Are you paying for it? So now I got to go through that. Fuck.
So Anthony, rather than distract everybody with your circumstances, why don't you focus a little more on what we talked about earlier today? That awareness you had.
Yeah, it was amazing. I started to have, it wasn't like something like this. This is mental obsession, which is planning something. Which is
We're losing you.
Oh, sorry. I had my finger over something. This is just normal mental obsession where you're trying to plan something. There's some variables.
None of it's normal. It's all abnormal. It's all a self-imposed, self-created conflict, always.
Okay. Well, what we were talking about earlier, what I was telling you is that I started to think about something that was starting to I could feel this feeling of unhappiness coming over, and I was just going to fill in the blanks of why. You know what I mean? That's where that's where we were going. We were going to go down a slope that we didn't want to go, and I was just going to make it why. And I realized, it's kind of true. Instead of fighting it and saying, no, it's not, that's not true in my head, I said, it is true. And these are just thoughts. And thoughts there's nothing true about a thought. It's just a thought. And then all of a sudden I didn't have to spend that was it. I went on and did something else. I didn't have to spend an hour wondering if it was true or not.
So you saw the immediacy of the dissolution when you simply let it be what it was.
Yeah. Yeah,
Okay.
that no matter
So-
what, there's no winning. That it's just no matter what this is. And I was kind of happy. Normally, I don't. Normally, I want it to be true because I'm always right. I think that the weird thing was this time I knew I was willing to give in and say I'm not right. And that's when I said these are just thoughts anyway. They're not true.
So if that's the basis and all you did was have it for what it is, anytime you are conflicted, you're having it for what it isn't. The only conflict is when we don't allow things to be what they are. Things are always what they are. They're always as they are. We are always as we are. In reality and truth, not only in what we're thinking. If what we're thinking is causing an imposition, it becomes depressing when that imposition is maintained because it's a weight we're creating by making believe we can confront, conflict, and fight things rather than simply concede things are always as they are, doing what they're doing, where we are, how we are, when we are together. It's all happening simultaneously for all of us.
And that's where the ego comes in maybe a little too, where that's where you're changing it. You know, I want to change it because my ego wants me to make sure that I still look good.
Your ego is a function of you making believe your thoughts are true. So you've created this alter ego to give you an impression you've got somebody to talk to in your brain when all you're doing is thinking about your thoughts.
Yeah.
We don't think to ourselves, we think to our thoughts. We don't talk to ourselves, we talk to our thoughts. To think that's a self is in fact what creates emotional insanity and emotional turmoil and conflict. It isn't a self, it's simply what we're thinking. When we think thoughts are true and real, we think they have control over us, so they're happening to us rather than being caused by us. And most of what we believe is our consciousness is only what we talk about to that self in our brain. That's just a very, very limited amount of our awareness that we're actually preoccupying our thinking with, thinking that someday if we talk to this self long enough, and think about that, if we have a self to talk to, we're already schizophrenic. We're already acting as though there's somebody else in there. We've already got.
I don't think that's actually true, right? Because I think most people do talk to themselves.
I don't know what most people do, Anthony. I'm suggesting if anybody's doing it, they're talking to a self born of imagination, born of thought. Self-centeredness is a thought centered in thought. It isn't a persona. It isn't a reality. It isn't who we are. This is one of the major glitches that resolves the ego. All of a sudden simply becomes a thought. It's not something that happens to us. It's not something that controls us. To the degree that I deny what I'm doing, all those effects are created by my own denial and my fight. They're not created because the ego has power. I want to pretend I don't have any power and blame the ego because I'm ashamed to admit I'm the one causing it.
Kind of makes sense.
Well, either thoughts are truth and reality, meaning there's no other truth in reality, or there's an absolute truth in reality that has nothing to do with thinking, except that thinking is a byproduct of it. Thinking is a consequence of it. Thinking is an option. Thinking isn't the problem here. It's thinking about thinking, creating truth and reality and becoming true and real that's the problem. They're just thoughts. They're imagined. They're analysis. They're estimates. They're best guesses. That's what thoughts are. They're doing their best to make sense of our environment so we can make better decisions. When we start operating on them as truth and reality, we start making decisions that lead to our demise, suicide, addiction. All of those things are consequences of this thinking, and none of them save us. So the idea that thinking harder about ourselves is somehow going to fix it is the insanity lying further to make believe that what we're doing now is okay. What we need to be doing is more and more of it. And that's exactly what a definition for both insanity and addiction is. It's a very fine, quick line we cross into insanity when we make believe that something that isn't real is real, and we start talking to something that doesn't exist as though it does exist. We're beginning to see and hear things that don't exist and make believe that they're all that exists. And that is not true or real, and that is the pretty basic definition of insanity.
Jack.
Yes, sir.
Is it not true that that the thing that you're talking to, it doesn't matter what thing you're talking to in your head, they're all the same, right?
Well, they may be different ideas with different content and appear differently, but in terms of them being thinking, I would say that they're all the same. It's just you're talking to your thinking.
Correct. So the entity is not really important. So when people constantly say that they're talking to their higher power and having these conversations, is it not just the same delusion?
Well, the difference is the idea of speaking to a higher power is beginning to speak beyond the limits of our thought and recognize if we think the limits of our thought define reality and truth, we don't think there's anything beyond them. So we defend them with our life literally by subjecting our capacity to the deteriorative disintegration and the demise of what suicide and addiction is. We're threatening our life by trying to maintain this defense of the limits. In fact, any limit in an infinite source or space is the beginning of everything else. It's not the end of anything. So speaking beyond the thoughts is the idea of what we do when we're starting to engage with a power greater than this self that we claim to be our only source.
You see the contradiction, don't you?
You mean that it's still based in thinking?
It's based on make-believe.
Well, if there
You attribute
there isn't
make-believe.
anything there that's real.
Hang on, that was a comma. You attribute make-believe to this talking to, and then you separate make-believe out of talking to whoever the fuck they're talking to.
Well, if it doesn't exist, there's nothing there. And the net benefit of it, the net benefit of it would probably cause more confusion and more conflict.
I totally agree.
In fact, though, given the history of Alcoholics Anonymous, I would say, and people who've gotten sober, it seems to begin to relieve people of the conflict, not at the root always, but it starts to relieve them of the conflict. If you can be relieved of one obsession, one compulsion, one impulsion, it's a window to the fact that it's our contrary thinking about what we can and can't do, that when I think I can control, enjoy my drinking, I keep drinking to prove it. I don't stop drinking. I keep drinking to prove that I can control it.
Right.
That's crazy.
So what I'm saying is that yes, it is a permission-giving device to take us out of ourselves. However, it is exactly the same as any other kind of, like, I think Anthony mentioned schizophrenia, that allows you to be involved in a conversation with a delusion.
Well, I would suggest if reality and truth are not delusional and actually real and true, when we begin thinking in those terms, thinking begins to actually do what it's designed to do at its highest functional literacy rate, which is to express intuitively, exactly as the book says. We will intuitively know how to handle situations that used to baffle us. Why did they baffle us? Because I was relying only on thinking. And now as I begin to rely on something that's infinitely capable beyond my limits, I begin to surrender that all the limits I ever imposed had no basis other than impacted my own thinking and my own ideas about everything else, including that infinite source. I can't make sense of an infinite source within my thinking, but I can also know that infinite source, not based in the words I use and the definitions I give it and the beliefs I have or the faith I have. I can notice that there's an absolute stable awareness that I have whenever I'm not conflicted and distracted by this internal distraction that I create in my thinking somehow the more I distract myself from reality and truth, the quicker I will prove I'm in control of reality and truth, when in fact, reality and truth is in control of us. It would be the nature of our existence.
I understand. And I go back again to the words that you use a lot, belief. Belief is what is beloved of you. You choose to believe in something.
Yeah.
But that doesn't make it any more applicable to something that is going to lead you in conversation to a better place.
Okay, so let's say that we all believed breathing would kill us. that breathing, that the best thing we could do would be to hold our breath. So our human experience would probably be very complicated by that thought if we really believed it was true, right?
Mhm.
Now, we all tend to breathe pretty confidently. We don't have to believe in breathing because we utilize the breath. Every time we breathe, we get a breath. It
Mhm.
actually is a functional capacity that we have. If
Mhm.
I'm thinking of things improperly and incorrectly,
Mhm.
then I would have those desperate consequences of my own experience based on the thinking I'm doing, not on reality or truth. It isn't a lack of air that I'm struggling with when I think there isn't enough air or that I shouldn't breathe air. It's a lack of commonality and common basis and substance of the thinking I'm doing. If I think humanly, substantively, I begin acting functionally in ways I can't even imagine when I'm in the confines of the thinking I'm doing. It starts to actually allow for the confirmation that there is something greater than certainly my limited thoughts, which means that any limits I have and any growth I have to do is always just letting go of the limits I'm maintaining. It's always, I'm being asked to grow because there's always more room to allow those limits to continue to grow in an infinite space and eventually realize all they ever are is my own defiance, my own defense, my own denial, my own reactiveness that's maintaining them. If that is the case, what am I afraid of? I'm afraid of being found out for what I'm doing. And I'm living in ways, if I believe in what's believable, I never have to believe in it again for it to utilize it. If I have faith in what is faithful, I never have to think of it again because it will always be faithful. If I trust in what is trustworthy, I will just naturally start doing that thing just like we breathe. Even when air is polluted, we tend to breathe it to get the most we can from it rather than hold our breath until we get out of it. If we did that for 3 or 4 minutes, I mean, you can hold your breath for how many minutes?
I've held my breath for 5.5.
Yeah. So John's a deep sea. What do you call it? What you do?
I'm a free diver.
Free diver. So at 6 minutes, if we were in bad air and thought we could hold our breath for 6 or 7 minutes, we'd probably suffer some consequences that would be very difficult or very debilitating. It's exactly what happens when we make believe something infinite needs our belief, needs our trust, it doesn't. It doesn't need us. We are actually byproducts of it. If it exists and we begin contemplating that it actually exists, and in fact, it's the basis of our existence, there's no thinking about it all that's necessary. But then I begin seeing the clarity of the thinking I'm doing better because I start seeing the conflicts as a byproduct of my thoughts rather than reality and truth. Rather than being condemned by something that's outside of my control, I begin to see that I am the one actually controlling and manifesting the conditions that I claim not to even want, which shows me if I can cause something and claim I don't want it, that's a pretty conflicted state of thinking. So we're talking only about functional capacity. How do we get better at being humans? How do we get better at sharing this? How do we get better at functioning together collectively? Rather than how do we go about refining the thoughts we've used historically to continue to make believe that our nature is abnormal and it's human nature to hate and kill and all that when it isn't natural at all. It's abnormal.
I understand what you're saying. If you remember my question, it is that are not all these thoughts in your head the same? And you answered that very eloquently. What happens, though, is that when belief is structured in, and, the whole little, blue globe here, is breathing, not necessarily thinking. The plants are breathing and the dogs are breathing but not necessarily thinking. They don't have beliefs about, not that I know of, that they don't have beliefs. They don't have beliefs about why they're doing this, that, and the other.
You know
so
why?
They don't have to. So hang on a second. So they don't have an idea of where to place their belief. So when we have a place to place our belief, and in the room, in the big book, you have it constantly that the belief is that placing it into a dialogue with something other than ourselves. And you say that is
where-
natural and that is, hang on, somebody's stepping on me.
Yeah, but I cannot hang
That
on
is
forever.
natural
You
and
keep
that,
going and
hang
going
on,
and
hang on.
going.
Do you not hear me talking?
I do. You're just going in circles because I have a question before you keep going. What
Well, I don't know
makes
why
you
your
think?
question comes in before I keep going. I
Well,
haven't finished my sentence.
you said that plants don't think. Where that comes from? Where that reality comes from? Because I just plant some beans and I put a stick and they are going around the stick, going up to the sun. They are finding the stick.
I'm sure they are.
The
They are
difference,
thinking.
the difference, if I may interject, which I know I may, is that knowing doesn't include thinking. And if all
Okay.
we're ever doing is thinking that thinking is knowing, we're undermining the potential we have to express knowing that doesn't include thinking. Intuition is defined as knowing beyond reason. That means reason, understanding, and thought are not included. The nature is a perfect example of something functioning very literally because it isn't thinking, which gives us a little bit of clue that it's the thinking we do that causes all these opinions about nature and reality and truth and the universe and the people that put us in conflict with them, not because we're in conflict with the people, but because we use nature and the world and all that stuff to justify the conflicted thinking we're doing. That's all that it ever is.
Yeah, and let me be clear. I'm not, here to upset your beans. What I'm saying is that the beans aren't thinking, yes, that they have to grow tall and strong because there is some other presence that tells them to. They have no belief. They do what they do. I understand your beans. But what I'm trying to say, Jack, is that that's all the same, except for this one important point that you bring up constantly is belief.
I don't know that I bring it up as much as I suggest that belief is unnecessary to what's real and true. But I would suggest that every obsessive thought is a function of belief because what we believe it to be is true when it's not. That's exactly what continues that vicious cycle.
And the opposite is true.
How do you see that?
What we believe what is not true to be true. And that continues the vicious cycle also.
That's the whole dialogue.
If we're in opposition, yes. If we're aligned, no. If we're actually conceding truth is true and giving it whatever its due is, whatever it is, which is beyond my thinking, I don't have to think about it and quantify it any more than the beans need to think about what they know to do. The universe.
After you have accepted the belief the first time,
no.
You don't have to get rid of it because it's
Nope.
in your pocket and
Nope.
you can use it all the time.
No. Just because we
why?
start, it's kind of like believing water in a gas tank will get you somewhere.
Uh-huh.
Doesn't mean that that's true, but if we rely on it, it doesn't change reality. It doesn't change the car. It doesn't change its functional capacity. All it changes is our relationship to it. So if my relationship to truth and reality is based on what I believe in it, rather than simply concede that true is true, that doesn't take belief at all. It's just as self-serving in the sense, but there's no self to serve. It's just saying truth is true. The universe functioned, reality and truth functioned well before humans ever arrived and started thinking. So there must be some basis that exceeds thinking. And to thinking is our only source, is to end up in this stymied, conflicted approach to reality and truth rather than an absolute. In the beginning of the big book, it talks about absolutely surrendering to alcohol, completely abandoning our old ideas in relation to whether we can drink or not. This is beginning to abandon any idea as being my reality and truth does not go away because I think it's here or don't think it's here. What changes is my functional capacity to express things on a basis of reality or a basis of fantasy. And if I'm only expressing what I make believe is true, I'm going to keep running into, nature's going to constantly slap me for trying to impose on it something that isn't true when in fact it's there to have anything true or anything real expressed. If I plant seeds, they're going to grow if I water them. If I keep seeds in the dark, they're not going to grow. It isn't the seed and it isn't nature. It's what I'm doing with it that creates that. So it isn't belief. When belief is unnecessary, faith is unnecessary, trust is unnecessary, agreement is unnecessary, because we are presently, right now, part of, not apart from, and if there's anything absolute, it must be our present experience, and all that we're conflicted over is what we think about it. That's it. So making that distinction is important.
And the construct that occurs with our thinking, and that's belief.
Belief and faith are not absurd if it's true.
Well, who determines truth, Gabe?
Functional
Truth does.
capacity and
No,
depression.
It's true.
If you're depressed, if you're conflicted, if you're in emotional turmoil, if you're insane, I would say you have belief in things that aren't true. Why? Because insanity is defined as seeing and hearing things that aren't happening. To have an internal dialogue about things that aren't happening as though they're real and true is the root of insanity. To begin to think of things that are true as true and concede that I don't even have to understand what that means for it to be true, I can now all of a sudden start operating in ways that I would never imagine within my thinking, and start to see that thinking is designed to express reality and truth rather than conclude reality and truth. It's not the maker of it. It's not the maker of belief of it. It's not the maker of faith of it. It's literally designed like a dam allows the water to flow through it. The point of that energy is letting it flow, letting it be.
As a good friend of mine says, well, that's a thought.
It is a thought. And yes, as humans, it's probably worth looking at our humanity accurately enough to begin to take the place like the bean sprout does and the tomato plants, and start functioning on a level that aligns with reality and truth, so we know exactly what to do rather than be in constant doubt and uncertainty about what we did, what we thought we should do, like you were describing, Anthony. All those questions are coming out of doubtful thoughts. What should I do? What are they going to think? What's the difference? I know what they're going to think. They're going to think what they think. What is the difference to you? Who you think they think you are, and what you think that you are in relation to what they're thinking about it. That's what has you worried about those thoughts. You're projecting an image of who you'd like to be, and confronted by who you think they may think you are, which is obviously never going to be who you think you are, because only you are in charge of that. And each of us thinks for ourselves, which isn't a self, it's just thinking about our own thinking. We each get to do that alone. We each get to do that individually. We each get to do that and make those choices seemingly alone. But in fact, the collective impact on that hits everyone. Everybody is affected by it because we aren't apart.
Yeah. Therein lies the rub. That's the responsibility.
Well, if an infinite nature is infinitely creative and infinitely loving and infinitely giving, and that is the essence of the universe, let's just say that. I can't tell you that. It doesn't matter. I don't have to believe in that for it to be true. I don't have to trust in it for it to be true. I don't have faith, but I can certainly suggest it and have that looked at and considered and see how that goes in terms of the consideration. What happened for me when I began seeing that as something that was ever present is the thinking I was doing became very, very small compared to the ideas I had of it being everything that was going on for me. Because I was imagining as truth and reality, all I was what I thought. So I thought all that was happening in the world is what I thought. And as a result, I felt conflicted constantly by what was happening, because it seemed to be things I didn't think would happen or should happen or could happen, while in fact they were happening. That's a major breach and conflict. So starting to see thinking as simply something I was doing began to be seen in a perspective that was very, very small compared to seeming like putting my hands over my face and seeing the world is no longer there. Just began to bring it into proper proportion. The book talks about that.
The old proportion thing.
Yeah. Well, and we make much out of little, meaning we make believe fantasy is true, which becomes everything to us when we think that way.
Yeah.
And that means that we've taken everything and reduced it to nothing, which can't be done. You can't chase something that's absolute away. You can't escape it. You can't change it because it doesn't change. It's an absolute state of being, present awareness. Now, clearly, I'm expressing that as a thought. Clearly, I'm expressing that in words. Clearly, the words aren't going to achieve that capacity. But as a suggestion, it's kind of like pointing to a mountain. I don't have to be pointing to a specific tree for you to see that the mountain is there in the distance. And the reference is, if this is accurate, if it is true, it isn't because I'm saying it, it's because it's true. It just is true as truth is true. And if there is that basis, and we all have it, then what we're doing to obscure it is self-imposed, self-induced, and that's the root cause of reactive, impulsive, and compulsive behaviors. To think they're happening to us is just another justification to make believe we have nothing to do with it, and it just replicates into this constant division of thought. Thinking more thought will solve it, just like more Coke, more drinking, more sex, more gambling, more food, any of those things that people associate to as far as symptoms. This is the cause that we're talking about, the root disease. There's almost 200 different programs, 150 to 200 different 12-step programs, all based in symptoms, but all with the exact same obsessive thinking as a cause, every one of them. It's a human dilemma because it's a human possibility. Any of us at any time can make believe something that is true, isn't true, or isn't true, is true. We're capable of that. And whenever we do, we set off an awareness in our system that something is wrong. And rather than see that as something to get away from and over, to begin to see it as really good information, to notice that what we're thinking is wrong, rather than continue down that path till the point that pain as the touchstone of growth has to get so bad that we only recognize it when things get horrible, rather than see it immediately as something we're doing now, presently. It's never down in the future. To postpone it tends to build, because we're stockpiling the energy. It's like we're taking little bits of gunpowder and putting it into the chamber, and eventually it explodes. And explosive behaviors are an example of this. And you can find those very often in relationships that are close, when people don't do what we want, when we don't do what they think they should be doing, when they don't do what they said they would. And it's easy to start seeing how much we value words because we think what they're saying is truth and reality, rather than just what they're saying at a present moment that may change.
So if this is true, what you're saying, then anytime you're having a bad thought and you say, oh, my thoughts aren't true, then it should just work. And in theory, you would never have a problem again.
Well, here's the issue, Anthony, and Santiago got into this last week. If all we think our consciousness is this conversation we have going on in our head, then humans had no consciousness before language was invented. And language didn't come immediately for humans. Language took time. John may have a better reference on what that took and when that started. But language was something that developed. It was one of our possibilities and capabilities that developed. But how many languages have we developed? There's hundreds of them. And when I listen to other people speaking their language, they're saying exactly what they mean, but I have no clue what they mean. So if I think the only limitation of my consciousness of the thoughts I'm having, I'm making believe that the language that I bear, that's my potential to commune and share ideas and concepts with other people, is the source of reality and the truth. I think of it as my consciousness. That's all now, think of all that our bodies are doing right now for us to be sitting here, thinking, looking, touching, turning our screens on and off. Takes millions, if not trillions, of interactions, synapses and neurological chemicals and all kinds of stuff is going on in our body. And it seems to know exactly what to do. And yet stress and anxiety and depression, which come from stress and anxiety, opposition, undermine every one of those systems that naturally know what to do. So what do? They turn health into unhealth. They turn ease into disease. And all of a sudden, bodies start suffering. What are they telling us? We're wearing a weight of opposition. We're making believe something that isn't even true is true, which means the problem isn't based in the thing we think isn't true. The problem is based in the thinking I'm doing right now about it as though it has any basis. So here we are having a bounty of information and consciousness that we don't even pay attention to because it doesn't go on in that conversation in our thinking. And we're thinking it's not there. And then feeling caught off guard when all of a sudden it seems to happen to us, rather than see it as something that's being caused by us the whole time. And that most of, to your point, Anthony, when I started seeing the thoughts as something I was doing, I started realizing there was a whole, what we call this subconscious, is where I kept all the thoughts I didn't want to be held accountable for. I didn't want to be responsible for. They were all the hidden ideas I had about the things that would be embarrassing to me and the things that wouldn't promote the appearance that I was trying to promote about who I thought I was. And all of a sudden, as I just became familiar with the fact that most of what I'm thinking, I don't even think I'm thinking, and started to concede that in the clarity that this superficial veneer that I was using to say, if I'm not thinking about it, it isn't happening. And starting to see that if I'm intimately connected to everything's happening, my whole body is functioning on the basis of everything that's happening, not just what I'm thinking. But my thinking is either undermining it in terms of health or it's promoting the health of it. By being less stressed and less anxious and less depressed, gives my body a chance to actually flourish and grow and heal naturally, because the systems in it are constantly trying to maintain balance. And when I, in my thinking and creating instability and imbalance, I'm constantly subjecting it to self-induced causes, and the self that's inducing it is only what I'm thinking about my thinking. That's it. When I started realizing that most of what I was thinking, I didn't even think I was thinking, I started having experiences that were very revelatory about instances in my past, especially that I held as being true and real in my brain, that I started seeing had been lies that I'd maintained for decades in the name of making believe that somehow or another, maintaining them, my life depended on maintaining those things. And I still find them every day to a degree. Now, when they occur to me, rather than think of them as happening to me, I begin to notice that I'm actually willing to start noticing what's going on, what's happening. It's part of my own growth. If I'm willing to see what I'm doing as what I'm doing, I start seeing what I don't think I'm doing as something I'm doing too a lot quicker, because my relationship to what I think I'm doing is no longer at odds. All of a sudden, I have a relationship to the rest of what I'm actually doing that's not at odds either. And as a result, I have a relationship that's productive and useful and actually begins to reveal itself to me, rather than make believe it needs to run and hide, which is what I had it do to make believe that it was off limits. Was beyond me, something I didn't have anything to do with. And that speaks to
Responsibility.
well, and also this fact that if there is an infinite source, it is also unseen. It's also not something we smell or taste or feel or hear, but it seems to be something we know in terms of the absolute stability that gives us the chance to notice how wrong we can be. If we didn't have a basis of stability, instability would be natural for us, and abnormality would be natural, and unhealthy would be healthy. All those things would add up. But in my experience, most people are clearly aware of what they're doing wrong because they feel wrong, they feel bad. They feel disconnected. They feel disjointed. All those feelings are accurate assessments of the thinking we're doing, not the reality we're facing. It's only when we think the thinking is real that we think the feelings are something to get over and feel better than, rather than thank and say, wow, that's great information. If I sit with that for a minute, it sort of dispels the rumor that there's nothing I can do about it because I'm the one doing it right now. And that transition shows how immediate everything that's happening is happening. There is no past or future other than in thought. The immediacy of everything is always happening where we are, and the impact on how we're thinking seems to be completely, it seems to consume us because we become intoxicated with the ability we have to set off all these chemicals in our own body, the adrenaline and the serotonin and all the stuff. Morning, Arliss. When we set those things off, we're literally intoxicated once again with chemicals. And we're creating it we're intoxicated with our own chemical factory. And we're using up chemicals that are there to have us feel well. And when we need them, they're gone because they're depleted. Because we're using them for emergencies that are going on 24 hours a day or however long we're maintaining these kind of thoughts. And all of a sudden, our body's taxed. It doesn't know what we're choosing isn't real. It goes, my brain functions at the disposal of my choice. It's going to do what I ask it to do. It's going to respond the way that I present to it. If I'm having a dream and it's terrifying, I'm going to feel the terror and feel that it's real. I'm able to manifest those things. That's our capacity to innovate and create in our brain is enormous. To think of it as reality is to condemn ourselves only to what we think rather than begin to express this greater sense of knowing that's natural.
So physiologically, do you believe I don't know why I'm using that word. I feel like physiologically, that's where our healing begins. When we concede and take responsibility. I mean, some people take it to, and I think that you have, and we have in our dialogue, believe that disease is pretty much caused by our thoughts. That
it certainly isn't ease.
Correct.
Right. So if there's discomforting, destabilizing, disturbing occurrences going on, it's obviously having that effect on our bodily functions because our brain is part of our body. Our brain's designed to help us function as humans, but it's also designed to express whatever there is to know that is beyond the brain. And to limit all we are is to what we think is to limit everything we do only to what we think. And humans have been masters at that, trying to disclaim the impact we've had when it's negative and try to overclaim the success we've had as though we discovered it. Well, what we discovered was things that always existed. We just decided how to commercialize them and utilize them. That doesn't mean we're the creators of reality. It means we've transformed pre-existing reality into forms that we value very often so we can condemn other people. So the sort of source of it reveals itself, the source of the thinking. The more I can get, the better off I am, not realizing everyone's already sharing in the totality of it all. Doesn't suggest I shouldn't have food in the refrigerator and do things that are useful to the immediate people I've committed to or seem to be responsible to. But to think in terms less than everyone being part of everything is to undermine my capacity to notice the influence I have, we have, and start doing things in this seeming self-centered, selfish way, rather than starting to see that the most selfish thing I can do, if there is a self to do it for, is the thing that's best for everyone, which would be to act on principles, because anybody who notices it, the attractiveness and sobriety is starting to notice things are working for people.
Mm-hmm.
People aren't attracted to somebody who's totally neurotic and completely manic and completely out of their minds and schizophrenic when it comes to sobriety. People tend to be attracted to people who are all of a sudden performing, functioning, doing things that work, that are useful for everybody else. And in the midst of sobriety, it's very simple because you can make the coffee and be a huge help to anyone who wants to drink coffee, or put the chairs up to all the asses that are going to sit in them. Huge benefit, rather than make believe I can't do anything and I just need to stay in my own thinking and nobody's going to do it for me and I can't wait and they're all wrong and all that stuff that we create is justification not to be acting responsibly and principally in our own existence. And it's all hogwash, we say, blaming the pigs, bullshit, blaming the bulls. We do everything but say, oh, this is us. This is what I'm causing, manifesting. It isn't that I can't utilize the innovation and the creativity of thinking. It's that when I make believe it's true and real, I have made believe truth and reality no longer exist except to my thinking. That's a major glitch in reality and truth.
So I had a pig hunter come over last night because I've had a huge pig problem, and they ate over 60 pounds of my sweet potatoes, and it's been a huge thing for me. It's been a problem, and I've systematically gone through it. So anyway, I got this guy, and he came over, and he's a full-blown pig eater. He eats like raw deer meat, like people eat sashimi, and he's here like 10 minutes, and he gets into dialogue about the absolute. And once he became responsible for everything, I couldn't believe it. I was like, the universe sent me like the Zen meat eater pig hunter that spent 3 years in an ashram. And I've never had dialogue with anyone outside of our group that totally immediately got the responsibility thing. And it was the coolest experience ever. And I mean, eating the raw meat thing kind of freaked me out a little bit, but you know what? That's fine. It was all fine, but it was beautiful too. That's why I laughed so much when you said the pig thing, because I just had this overwhelming problem, like ripped up thousands of dollars worth of my plantings and stuff. And here comes the Zen guy, and he's going to handle it.
Something I discovered I spoke at a meeting down the South Bay some time ago, and some guy said, you remind me of this guy that Bill Wilson used to listen to. And he got me what's called the Recovery Bible. And it's a combination, it's probably 1,000 pages of William James and a guy named Ralph Waldo Trine, who wrote in the late 1800s a thing on the infinite. And it's on YouTube. I attached the link to I don't tend to attach these things lightly. I think if they're beneficial to us broadly, I include them, like the thing that Herb Kagan wrote about when did meetings become the program, and the other thing on near-death experiences that seem to mirror this vital spiritual experience that people seem to have when they make that transition into sobriety. Seems to happen when people face death. And aren't we really just facing the death of ego in sobriety? We're starting to actually confront the fact that this thing that seems to be so critical to us is actually just an imposition of thought, prancing around as though it's imposing as us, is an imposter. And it's really the death of that we start facing in sobriety. That life has become unmanageable. The second half of the first step is about the unmanageability of living now that we've admitted we're powerless over alcohol, because we're facing life for the first time without this seeming solution we had. So he speaks in beautiful, he wrote this in the late 1800s, and from what I read, it sold over 2 million copies, which is a pretty good, just producing 2 million copies back in the late 1800s was probably a bit of a chore compared to today, where you can do it in 8 minutes on a printer. But it's very, very insightful. I suspect there's some of it that I would contend with a little bit, because I tend to contend with things. But it's the roots of it are absolutely grounded in what Bill Wilson learned and looked at in writing the big book and in addressing this thing that had through history been impossible to cure or resolve, which was alcoholism. And it included drug addiction, and it included food and sex and gambling. All these other things are byproducts of the same 12 steps he developed, because they're principled. The principles can be used in any way. And he says, why, having been granted perfect release from alcohol, shouldn't we be able to achieve the same result by the same means, achieve freedom from all of our defects and difficulties? Bill says that in his writings. He's seeing this broader scope. And yet his primary focus was on getting people sober long enough to make sure that AA was on solid ground for those people who wanted to come in and get sober to begin with, to those people who weren't quite sober. And he talked about this as being the emotional sobriety letter he wrote, talked about this as being the new frontier that the oldsters would start to notice as being the real goal of sobriety. He talked about it. He introduced it. Ralph Waldo Trine talked about it's a 4-hour link to the book, but it's an audio book. If you're driving somewhere, it's very interesting to listen to, because the guy reads it very clearly, and the writing is very dense and compact and very, very insightful. Not INCITE, but INSIGHT, insightful. It sort of complements this conversation and the essence of this fact AA came out of a shift of religions that started to ask, why are we fighting one another? And why are we not doing what Jesus did originally, which was to heal and love? That's what he talked about essentially. And in the late 1800s, Church of Religious Science, Science of Mind, Emmett Fox, what was his name? Holmes. I forget his first name, but he wrote and they wrote. Christian Science came out of that, which was all about what John had talked about. Healing is a product of thinking. If we put our bodies under stress, they are bound to depreciate our capacity to appreciate our healing capacity. They're bound to be undermined by those things. And I would say we've been very good at creating diseases to get to the point where we take it for granted that they happen as though that's normal, and we don't see healing very often in relation to that. We think healing is something absurd. We think healing is a miracle when healing is actually what nature does. Nature does it automatically. You can see it happen in nature all the time, to Santiago's point earlier. And Jana, I doubt those pigs thought those sweet potatoes were yours.
No, they've come back every night for 10 nights. They're in hog heaven, so to speak.
Yeah.
They've eaten everything. My taro's all gone. They're so fat and happy. Someone's going to eat them, though, and be very happy about it. I'm pretty sure. I can't do it, but in 4 years, I never, ever had a pig problem. And it's been a lot.
So salmon fed as first timers. I'm always available during the week if you want to spend a little time.
Appreciate it.
Which can often help, and trying to sort some of this out and trying to sort of get oriented in it. My experience is the discussion. When I used to do this one-on-one for many, many years, I've always worked on the principles when it came to the steps. I never took people through the book. I said, if you can read the book, do what it says. Let's talk about the questions you have, giving them the chance to begin to recognize it's what they did, not what I did for them that made the difference. And so my effort has always been in the direction of principles and reaffirming that principles are not divisible. They're not inequitable. They don't discriminate. They're absolutely the nature of existence, at least within the context of our universe, which I would say compared to the infinite is very small and very manageable in terms of nature being so consistent. It tells us all the time whether we're working with it or whether we're opposing it. It's very clear about that. Our consequences are constantly telling us how well we're doing in relation to the thinking we're doing, in relation to everything else that's happening. So we don't have to believe that for it to be happening, to John's point earlier. The idea that if we believe in something believable, it immediately works. We feel the comfort, we feel the intuitive state of presence, the peace, the sense of knowing we know comes immediately. That's what intuition is. It's just that sense of knowing we know. And some of that can be developed, like William James talked about, the spiritual experience can be garden variety or white light. Some of the garden variety is just stuff that we develop and we learn in time and we get better at and start to see. It's kind of like refining something over time, like David chipping away at that marble until he came up, or Michelangelo's chipping away at the marble till he found David inside that. It's something that happens over time. The white light, and one of the other links at the bottom of the announcement is for a doctor who spent 50 years now talking about near-death experiences, who, when he started back in the 70s, anyone who ever talked about their near-death experience was considered insane, and they would fire them from their jobs because they would say that they're not capable of performing a function within, especially if they were in law enforcement or teachers or whatever else. So people wouldn't talk about their experience. And around 1972 or 3 was when the term near-death experience was coined by a doctor. And this doctor spent 50 years now studying these experiences because he had an experience when he was an intern that had someone who was in a coma delivered to an emergency room. And he didn't know what she had taken. And he spent some time with her friend in the hallway. And when she came to, he said, "I was talking to your friend." And she said, "I know." And he said, "What do you know? What do you mean you know?" He said, "Well, I was there." She said, "I was there." He said, "What do you mean you were there? You were in the room. I was 100 feet down the hallway with your friend." She said, "I know. I was there. I heard you. I heard everything you said." And he thought they were in a conspiracy, the girlfriend and the girl that had the coma, to create that experience. Because he was a scientist, he said, I had to reduce all the possibilities. Could they have possibly been conspiring to have this happen? Could they have agreed that she would pretend she's in a coma and she would pretend to be in the hallway, and she would then tell her when she was in the coma what we had talked about so she could wake up and say that she knew? And the one thing the girl said, because the doctor, just before he was at lunch and he'd gotten some food on his tie. So when he got the call, he buttoned his white lab coat up higher than the stain on his tie. And she said to him at the end, she said, "I noticed you had a stain on your tie," which wasn't anything that girl could have ever known. So he started saying, this is happening. He started seeing it more, started focusing on it more, and started realize it very much follows the vital spiritual experience that William James and Carl Jung talked about in terms of being necessary for somebody to have this psychic shift. Because people that come back from those experiences don't fear death in the same way. And they actually resist getting back into their bodies. When it comes time to come back, almost every one of them says, "Fuck no." Because this condition, I suspect, we've been living with has been considered a human condition rather than one induced by thinking. And so that enormity, there was one of the women in the story in his book was underground for 30 minutes. She went off the edge of a waterfall in a kayak, and the water held her down for 30 minutes, and she survived without any little bit of brain damage at first, but she got over it all. And she talked about her awareness that whole time of knowing what was going on. So if that reality is reality, it must be now, it must be where we are. White light is the culmination of all different colors, and/or all colors are fractured states of white light, meaning they're passing through mist if they're rainbows, or my suspicion, thinking, because we associate colors to emotions, red and yellow and green and blue, and all of the colors seem to be attached to emotions, which means when I'm willing to allow what's happening happen, I am experiencing a white light rather than the division of emotions I feel when I'm fighting for my own sense of things, my own thoughts. And in science, when they began to actually assess, and I forget what they call this, there's an effect, and I'll find it and mention it, but they started to notice the light coming from stars always filled the visual spectrum. The light spectrum is a very small part of the electromagnetic spectrum. And when they started noticing that every star promoted its light, there were little black lines. The colors align with the elements, by the way. So the elements are essential to all matter in the universe. And all the colors that lined up would all be the spectrum, but along there, they would have lines missing. There were these black lines that I forget the name of the effect. But it turned out that the missing lines actually corresponded with the thing that the star had. Carbon, helium, whatever its makeup was the thing that was missing in the light spectrum. So what's interesting about that is we think the light spectrum is missing, while in fact it's identified in our inability to see it. It's actually qualifying its place as it is. Light that travels through space does not light space up when there's nothing in space. It only lights things up that it lands on. If there's dust, like our atmosphere, it looks like our sky is blue. Our sky is not blue. It's the color that the dust and the moisture and all that create as a result of the light passing through it. So the absence of that in our experience, to claim that because we can't see it, it doesn't exist, is once again to claim that all that exists is what we see and think, with our eyes, rather than see that understanding is another form of seeing. Understanding is how we see things. People say, do you see what I mean? They're asking us, do we relate? Do we have a connection in this understanding that I have? So if we're understanding things correctly and applying those correct understandings within the human context, we start noticing and knowing that we can't even comprehend or understand, but we can absolutely know and rely on and begin to function on the basis of simply by admitting it is what it is, as it is now, and we're all part of it. We are not divided from it. We can't be divisible from it. It doesn't discriminate. It doesn't favor you or me or anything, because there is no spatial bounds in it. It's not a time-space bound element. Most of what the physicists recognize about the nature of the universe is our third dimension that we tend to live in, third and fourth dimension, is small compared to the enormity of what they consider to be reality in the universe. And if we're small in relation to that, imagine what the universe is in relation to an infinite source, where there are no bounds whatsoever. It literally makes the universe impossible to even exist. And in mathematics, points can't technically exist, though mathematics is based on them, but they realize that any size a point has takes up the space of other points. So if a point takes up a point, it can't really exist as a point because it's constantly obstructing other points. It's pretty interesting when you think about our thinking, trying the same thing. We're constantly fighting to make a point that we never seem to be able to make, at least be happy as a result. There's nothing there but what we're thinking.
So how about the question, Jack, that you were asked, if it's possible to become more spiritual in your, is there levels of spirituality?
Not if it's infinite. There are no levels. There are no spatial dimensions. There is no time. It is an ever-present state of being. And I would say, Anthony, if you know it now, even in the midst of asking the question. The fact that you can ask that question confirms that you exist, that you are part of it, that you are absolutely not in it or out of it, but of it, whatever it is. Heidegger said if we can ask the question, it confirms our existence. So to think the question is doubtful when in fact it confirms our existence is to doubt the question we're thinking. So it sort of begins to unravel this preoccupation of thinking is the source, thinking is the solution, thinking more about thinking is the answer. When in fact our thinking gets better, we don't have to do as much because we have a sense of what's right, we have a sense of what's wrong, because we notice the disturbance and the conflict quicker and concede that that's what it is that's telling us something's wrong, not in reality and truth, but what we're thinking about it. We become more sensitive to it, more aware of it. And or we become better at denying it in time and thinking that somehow if we keep fighting it and trying to feel better than it and get over it, that that's doing anything other than making believe that somehow or another it's going to go away while we constantly confirm it by thinking there's something to get away from and feel better than. And often that's what I would say self-help and humanity is aimed at, is seeking better ways at feeling better about what's wrong rather than simply getting better at conceding what's wrong. So there's no reason to feel better because it all of a sudden takes away all the things that are depressing and conflicted and emotional turmoil. It just starts to evaporate, which most of us have experienced in sobriety. Doesn't mean there isn't more to do, more to go. Bill said more will be revealed. We know only a little. That means that within our human context, it's probably worth looking over the edge and realizing the edge is the beginning of everything rather than the end of anything. And the edge in our thinking, like the horizon, you can never achieve. The more you try to get to the horizon, the further it moves away every inch you move toward it. So it's sort of like trying to be in the present. If you are present, you're already in the present, always. We hear people say this all the time, I need to work on being in the present. If what we're doing is repeating a story that we're not in the present, what we've worked on so long is the story that's trying to make believe that it can, by being told over and over again, void truth and reality. And that can't be true or real. It's just a story. It's just a repetition of an idea that isn't true, trying to become true by being repeated over and over and over again. And in society, we've heard in the last years, if you repeat a lie long enough, eventually it becomes true. That isn't true. You know who tells that? People who want to lie. Liars tell us that. And I would say we all qualify under that in terms of not being liars, but lying within the context of our thinking to any degree we make believe something is true that isn't true. Isn't to say we can't do that, but that we can. And when we do, noticing what it is, we will either choose to continue freely or we will choose to stop. And to notice that we were never condemned to continue. It was only us thinking it was the only thing we could do that gave that impression. Very clever, convenient, cunning, baffling way of dealing with thinking. To help us to the idea we had no other choice. The reality is choice always allows not to be chosen. If it weren't, it wouldn't be a choice. There would be no reason to use choice as the excuse, which we tend to. I had no other choice. To say you had no other choice doesn't make any sense because choice always allows not to be chosen. Doesn't mean choices can't be limited or the limits of those choices can't be determined by the thinking I do about them. Certainly I can do those things, but it doesn't mean I'm compelled or condemned to choose. It means that I'm choosing to choose. Most people tend not to say, I am choosing no other option. I'm choosing no other choice. We tend to say, I have no other choice. There is no other choice. There was no other option. It's not true. That's how addiction maintains itself. I'm condemned. It's happening to me, has nothing to do with me. And as a result, I'm constantly fighting the effect rather than noticing I'm the cause. As Jana talked about in terms of responsibility, when I begin to realize I'm the cause of my entire experience, it starts to make a lot less sense to do things that are hard to experience. Doesn't mean I don't do them. It just means it makes a little less sense. And somehow they begin to evaporate, just like the fog when the sun comes out seems to know to dissipate. So those foggy notions under the light of seeing things accurately, because my sense is seeing them accurately is that light that we all share, that we use either metaphorically or literally to speak of an enlightened source, a being awareness, an absolute knowingness.
Like my beans, they know where the sun is and they know how to get there.
The plants.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, then it's their design. We have a design too. Clearly, if we're functioning on the basis of opposing the design that we have, the chances are we're not going to function very well. So it's a pretty obvious example or occurrence to notice that. And I would suggest the disturbing nature, just as Bill says, whenever we are disturbed, no matter the cause, he adds, because he knows that we will think, well, he didn't mean this time, this person, that circumstance. No matter the cause, something is wrong with us. It's not wrong with us in terms of being, it's wrong with us in terms of the self we think we are, the thinking we're doing about who we think we are. That's what's wrong. So to see that rather than run from it, to see it accurately is to say, oh, this is actually valuable information. Thank you. Just like if you turn the pot, the plant knows where the sun is. It turns. Within a day, you'll see the leaves will turn toward the sun. They're not arguing because they're based in knowledge. If they're based in knowledge, what might we be based in? Perhaps the same. And to think we aren't would be a major glitch in all of our thinking and all of our doing, since thinking is a basic action that we take that always precedes every other voluntary action that we make. Every voluntary action comes from a voluntary thought because we're choosing it. And nobody else can choose for us. We get sober alone, but we stay sober together. Meaning that thought that maybe I have a problem. Maybe this thing I'm doing is what I'm doing. Maybe that possibility, opening that door, allows for the potential for the individual to come to terms with the mess they're making, because nobody can talk us in or out of that because we are all free to think what we want. And that freedom doesn't condemn us until we make believe we're not doing what we're doing and thinking what we're thinking. Do we feel condemned by what we're thinking and doing? So nobody else is ever going to do it for us. And what's freeing about that is admitting it and recognizing it. It's not what I say. It's not what anyone else does or says. It's what you do with what you hear and what you think and what you feel.
But you don't understand, Jake. My case is different.
Well, I agree with you. And in fact, the cases we create, the mental cases we create are different. Just like the way we each interpret these things we're talking about as being universal, we all have different thoughts about them, which is fine. We all see them a little differently. We don't have to homogenize around these ideas, but seeing that truth is true would certainly be pretty fundamental to seeing things truthfully. And that is a pretty easy thing to maintain, so that things become we are as we are becomes a pretty easy thing to begin to just entertain and say, oh, well, if that's the case, there's not a lot of doubt in that. There's not a lot of uncertainty in that. But my uncertainty and doubt in relation to that starts to become clear. And I start to say, oh, there's a little place for some work. And where's there? Here, now, with what I'm doing, how I'm thinking. It's not out there somewhere. It's always where we are. And that's if we have any individuation, it's the choices we are allowed to make freely for our seeming self, but in fact, we impact everything and everyone with everything we do, because we're not disconnected. We're in an interrelated, interactive, interrelated, and we can choose to be interreactive by the reactivity of our own thinking. That exchange we have becomes polluted by that, and it's toxic because it really has no place but in other people's thinking. And you can see today there's a lot of reactiveness occurring that is having people do things that make absolutely no sense. And I would say reactivity on its basis is insane, because it's the idea if I fight for something longer, it's going to become true, when the thing I'm fighting for has no basis in reality at all, but only in my thinking. Thinking is not the fundamental basis of reality. Thinking is the basis for thinking. And if I'm thinking correctly, the chances are I'm going to choose to do things functionally and beneficially and usefully, gainfully, as the book says.
One thing that I want to...
You're not coming through, Santiago.
Oh, I'm sorry. I am in a bad spot. I talk to you later then. Sorry.
That's better wherever you are.
Okay. You hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. I want to check this with you. I don't know. When I hear somebody saying, oh, I'm going through this, God is testing me, that really sits bad with me. Like really, what the hell? God doesn't have nothing better to say, okay, I want to talk with Pepe today. Let's see how he responds. What is your opinion about this? And why bothers me so much?
If we think thoughts are true and real, we immediately think who we become is only what we think, which is ego. That's our God. We, as creators of reality, create an ego. So what are we doing with that ego? Constantly negotiating for what we want with something that doesn't even exist. So my impulses for what I want, I'm trying to have something that doesn't even exist satisfy. And what do? Blame God. use God as an excuse. If I've already been given everything, there's nothing I can get from God. But I might want to suggest that I'm willing to take better direction, and I'm willing to be open, and I'm willing to be aware of things that I might not have thought of as possible in that intuitive potential for that expression. So that's my take on that, Santiago. I could easily be wrong, but my sense is if we become the creators of reality by thinking thoughts are true, then we think when we think about our thinking, we create a self that is, in fact, we literally think we've created a being, but the being has no substance. It's just a thought. So what is it? A lie. What's the ego? A false impression. It's an alter ego. We even talk about alter ego as though ego isn't altering. So do you remember the quote that was in this week's thing? Why do we talk to God about our problems when we can talk to our problems about God? That was a very interesting turnaround. That came out of something that I was sent by another friend this guy had followed some preacher from the early 1900s who said that. And I said, that's exactly what we're discussing. And he was talking about healing. This guy was a Pentecostal and talked about healing and claimed to have healed a lot of people. And, there's some doubt to what they did. And everybody seems to have a little bluster in their step. But I don't know. I just like that he put the shoe on the right foot by saying, why not address the problems by saying, there's an infinite source. How could you actually exist and be a real problem if it weren't something I was creating and inducing by my own experience, by my own interact? If I'm having the experience, I'm creating the cause. Somehow or another, I'm interacting with it. You follow that?
You asking me?
Yeah.
Of course I follow. What do you think? I'm stupid?
Santiago.
Santiago, I noticed you smiling a little bit more recently during these discussions.
Oh, that was awesome. Cute Santiago.
So, I just lost you had me laugh through a train of thought. Responsiveness. Signs of life, typically, John has a little bit of medical history, but signs of life are generally whether somebody's responsive when they're found to be in a condition that might be questionable. Are they dead? Signs of life are responsive. And what is response but the ability to respond? That indicates our own ability to respond, indicates we are alive as humans, that this is an indication of our life, that ability to respond. Our experience is based on how we respond. It doesn't happen to us, it's caused directly by us. It doesn't mean that if we weren't thinking, we wouldn't have an experience, but I would suggest if we weren't thinking, our experience would be very peaceful, because our ability to observe what's going on includes knowing this absolute state of presence, which is peaceful, which gives us the distinction of what's disturbing. It offers us the freedom to that when things are conflicted, we're aware of it. We wouldn't know that if all we were was conflicted. We would think that's normal and there would be no conflict in it. It would be nature. It would be stability, and it doesn't feel that way. Morning, David.
Good morning.
So there are confirmations of this awareness that we have if we're willing to concede them at all. They become obvious. There's a sense of peace. There's a sense of calm. Could that be induced by a lie? Yes. But it would also take 24-hour-a-day thinking to maintain it. And I would say that would not generate calm. Denial is psychic anesthesia. It gives us a false impression immediately that we got it covered because of the chemicals we induce in our system. They create excitement. create a sense of control, dynamism. It's dynamic, happening, I'm in charge. But what we're doing is depleting our potential to actually respond in the future because our body's using for a non-emergency chemicals that are often reserved for real emergencies where there is a threat. And so we become depreciated, depressed, seemingly unable, out of control. So denial, while it seems to work, never works because it's always just simply postponing what eventually will be faced. And the only way not to face it is to die. And I would say that's a suicidal tendency. To make believe what we're doing is not what we're doing is a prayer for non-existence. We're praying not to exist to even have our experience. We're setting it up to make it make more sense to do what we can to kill ourselves. And addiction is very much that thing. Bill says, for us to drink is to die. That goes for every compulsion. None of them are ever healthy. Nobody has overdosed from broccoli yet or cauliflower. Though apparently you can drink too much water and die if you drink it too fast. So there are examples where excess, even amongst things that are healthy for us, can kill us.
Jack,
Yes, sir.
I'm going to have to jump, but there was something very interesting that in what Santiago said, because when I was getting first into this stuff years ago, I would hear things and I would grab onto them, and then they would gradually cycle out of my head, and especially as they weren't useful, because as you said earlier, we hear things, we interpret things individually, even truths we do. And I think the important thing for me to focus on, just to keep me out of trouble, just that alone, just to keep me out of trouble, is to remember that thought and language and all of these things are tools. And thought is useful. I remember being told early on, when the book says our problems are basically of our own making, it means basically we make up problems and there's no solution to an imaginary problem. That mitering a joint, for example, is a problem, and we can think about this, or how to get something to eat is a problem. We think about this, and we can get to a solution. So we're using the tool of our thought, to our advantage. Sayings, aphorisms, they're all useful to some people. They are tools. But when I try to solve an imaginary problem, I might as well be practicing gymnastics on the ocean and wondering why that's not working. Because they're all site specific and they're all contextual. And as we're talking even now, and we're sifting in and out, and we're hovering around this idea of the inexactness of thought, and certainly as a basis for reality. That's been just debated back and forth from Heidegger to Kant to you name it. I think what Santiago was suggesting is, if you want to bite down on some knucklehead saying just out of the blue, God is testing me, I mean, I can bite down on that and I can have my day ruined. But that's that guy's idea of what this particular set of circumstances is presenting to him. It's comforting in some way, or provocative in some way, to imagine that there's this being that is suddenly focused on me and saying, well, let's see if you can handle this. And I don't think of it that way. I don't understand that. And I was raised evangelical, and I didn't understand that either. It just took me a long time to realize that it was all right, that didn't float my boat. It was okay. It didn't mean it didn't help somebody else. I mean, for God's sake, I drove a guy for years out in Sullivan County, a farmer, to meetings, and his theology was pretty basically, based on the Holy Trinity, and it kept him sober. He was a useful guy, whatever. for me to reject how he expressed himself out of hand or to think it had anything to do with me would have been detrimental to my own experience. But I don't have to bite down on it. I don't have to sit there and take it in my teeth and run with it. And I think that's what I love about jumping in and out of this. As I say, we got a lot going on here. I'm glad I got in for a little bit. But I've always appreciated this constant focus in this situation about the unreliability. Just basically that, the unreliability of my thinking. That it tends to want to perpetuate itself. It tends to want to prove itself to be true. My thoughts, they're not my enemies. They just have one goal, is to keep themselves going. They're not trying to fuck me up. They just like to hang around,
Well,
So-
and my suspicion, Arliss, is that to the point you made about creating the problem and thinking there's a problem to solve, is starting to see that the only problem is thinking the problem has any reality in it that we haven't given it, and recognize it's the same with thinking. The only time they seem to do this circular thing is when we think they're going to get somewhere that they can't be because they're here now as what they are.
Right.
And my sense is we've dehumanized God and become inhumane as a result. We've humanized God, which has made us inhumane. We've made believe that ego is God and that God gives and takes. Interesting how vicious God can all of a sudden be. And it basically has all that identifying markers of humanity, acting in inhumane ways, imagining a hateful, spiteful God could condemn us, rather than starting to see that we've probably never even come to terms with what love even means.
Yeah.
We even talk about some love being unconditional as though normally it's conditioned. That's crazy.
Right.
Just the concept is like so beyond. It's a giving of a giving of a give. And then you realize, no, we already have it. It must be all the natural state. That's incomprehensible to the kind of thinking that we've collectively done. So I appreciate that very much.
Well, the issue for me about that question of why this is happening to me, is God testing me, is a negation of the different colors in life. And that is where the blessing is. In health or illness, in pleasure or pain, all of those are blessings, because without the night, you cannot appreciate the sun. Without the rain, you cannot appreciate a good day in the beach. So when you start thinking, or when we start thinking, things should be this way, it's a very dangerous place.
Well,
Because
most of that thinking, Santiago, is coming out of the ideas we have that we think are true. So we think the only thing that should be happening is what we think. And there again, it's revealed in the insistence we have about what's happening. Imagine what's happening is happening, and it's happening for everybody right now as it's happening. And you and I can think it shouldn't be happening. That's a pretty broad leap to take something that's happening and pretend it shouldn't be. Right? That's a big attack. That's a major. My sense, though, is when we think God is testing us, what we're missing is that we are testing out our own thoughts. God isn't testing us. We are testing our own thoughts because we're stuck in this cycle of saying what works and what doesn't work. I keep trying to apply what doesn't work, and I keep thinking it should work, and I keep getting frustrated because it never works. So what I need to do is apply it harder. And that's the addictive cycle of thought and or compulsions. More and more and more is never enough. When enough is never enough, how will more ever be enough? It's crazy.
Well, because we're uncomfortable with neutrality.
I don't suspect we are, but I suspect all those other thoughts we're maintaining seem to be, because their threat, a lie's threat, is truth and reality. So what is it? Ever presently in the face of the threat. So what do those things do? Cause fear. What do we think? We're afraid of truth and reality, when in fact it's truth and reality that's giving us the clear understanding. What we're afraid of is maintaining the ideas that we think are true and real. That's the whole self-centered fear. It says self-reliance is the source of fear in the book. What is that? We're relying on a self that doesn't exist, just like Arliss just described the problem he created as though there's a solution to it, is noticing he's the creator of it. Boom, problem solved, gone. Can we maintain it? Absolutely. Can we want what's impossible to get? Of course. Will we get it? No. What we're going to get is a lot of antagonism. We're going to get worn down like David sanding that sculpture eventually after he chipped away all the things that got him to the point that he refined it into the graceful piece of marble that it is today, that Michelangelo, whoever it was that hammered away at that thing. So our abilities turn to disabilities when we make believe all that's true and real is what we think. And I would suggest from my own experience that to some degree, we're all doing this for us to be doing it collectively and see so clearly what's wrong in the world and not notice that we're part of the world that's wrong. It's a world of our own making, a world of our own thinking, a world of our own seeming understanding, which is a misunderstanding of what's actually happening. So the better we get talking about this with one another, with others, the better we begin seeing our own frailty and even discussing things in absolute terms, and start noticing how clever we've gotten at discussing things that aren't absolute at all and making believe that we've really gotten our point across and we've really made it clear when we've created just another layer of obscured, foggy notions.
Jack, I think Santiago brought up earlier the language aspect, and I thought I remember a TED talk I watched a long time ago, and it's always stuck with me because it was a gentleman who was he did research in how language affects finances, money, savings, debt, and what he found was Japan. I'll just use Japan's example because that's the one he explained, but he found a dozen, I think, countries that in their language, they don't use terms like I will have. They don't use sentences like I'm going to get paid. So obviously in America, it's like I know what I'm going to get paid Friday, so I know how much money I'm going to have. But in Japan, there's no verbiage for that. It's only what I have, what is currently in my account. So those countries like that tended to not have as much debt and tended to have more in savings. And I was like, holy crap, when you just said what you said earlier about language affecting us as we've evolved, we clearly didn't have a language when we originally were, our ancestors were here. But just to think of it as an aspect of what you think, which is what we always talk about, what I think is what I know, and that is what is real. But when you even consider that there's a different country that has a different language that doesn't even use some of the sentences we use.
Well, and then Ken Burns did a documentary on the Indians, the Southwest Indians, and he said that some of the Indians had been so self-sufficient in the neighborhoods they were in, they'd have like a 30-mile scope. They'd never leave. They'd never
specific problems anymore.
No, I know it's not specific.
Anthony?
Problem.
Yeah.
You got to mute.
Sorry.
He said that some of the tribes that were discovered by the Spaniards that they came up had so little exposure that they didn't even know there were other tribes beyond their scope of the land that they used that was sufficient for them. There were dozens of languages, and he said most of those languages didn't have the word I. It was we and us. And the other thing that he discovered is that in most of them, women were in charge, not the men. So that's probably been buried. So, but language reflected the thinking people did. It was developed around what we thought. So it doesn't mean that language is real and true. It just means language is an expression of thought. It's something humans are capable of doing. Our ultimate language is in silence. If there's a knowing nature that is silent and quiet and unseen, the invisibility of it is the indivisibility of it. It is the actuality of it. It is the knowing of it that we don't hear in words, but certainly could translate in words in a knowing way that might be better guides than making believe fighting our thinking is somehow going to get us to a point that would resolve a problem that we're having.
Well, and it's interesting you say that, because I'm just considering right now people that we always talk about struggle mentally with mental health problems. That's all in silence. For the most part, they're not expressing most of that. And that's what most people will say is like, oh, we never knew, or this and that. But
we're almost always talking to the self we think we are. So we think we're being public about it, when in fact, all that's happening is the public's looking and wondering, what the fuck is he doing? What's he thinking about? You can see that people are deep in thought, right? They're generally talking to this self. They're not really contemplating on a basis of being open to what's happening around them. They're trying to figure out this thing they've got going on inside that never seems to be resolved, because we're making believe that conversation actually exists. Just like Arla's just mentioned, he's created the problem and realized the problem is in the creation of it, not in the thinking of it as something substantive that has an issue. It's just the thinking of it. If we're thinking of things that are actual and real, we're going to be able to express them in ways that would be functional and useful for everybody. And people then don't have to think much to do it. It's like math. Once you know 2 + 2 is 4, you don't tend to go through the whole learning process every time to reuse it. You start knowing in that sense. That's what we know as our understanding as knowing is something that is useful every time. And that's why it's crazy to constantly use what's useless as a source of thinking and think someday it will become useful if we keep using more and more and more of it. What we get is more devious and cunning and baffling in our own conclusions, and think we're getting better because we've learned how to defend better and how to misrepresent better and how to appear differently, when in fact it's just driving us crazy. Again, we don't have to be driven to be experiencing, because it's always going on where we are. The immediacy of it is the awareness of it. So to any degree we don't think we're where we are and know what we know, all we're entertaining are thoughts that aren't true. And we don't have to think we know what we know to know what we know. And we don't have to think we are where we are to be where we are. And if we're always where we are, which I would suggest you can begin to test this, because you'll start to notice whenever you check in, you're always going to find yourself exactly where you are in terms of your body. You're always going to be there. And whenever you're thinking, you're going to be in that same place. And whatever you're doing, because all that happens only happens in the present. And the present is not a divisible form of time, because it can't have a period of time that could take other periods of time, just like the point can't exist in math because it can cover the points. So this is the beginning of looking at what Leibniz and Sir Isaac Newton created in calculus, was starting to take all the points of algebra that created these choppy lines, turning it into a graceful fluid line in calculus, because it dealt with the infinitesimals. What did they do? Introduce the concept of, they created, I believe, a factor of the infinite, like a number. They inserted it into the formula, and all of a sudden it smoothed all those things out that used to have to be done much more mechanically with lines to lines, to point to point to point to point. All of a sudden it became graceful. If we apply the same infinite as a factor of our existence, chances are we will operate more gracefully and more fully and more thoughtfully and all the gratefully. Not just gracefully. We will be grateful because we'll recognize the fullness of greatness that we have. Speaking of grateful and greatness.
I'm leaving.
See you later.
Well, cute.
Have a good day, Katie.
Thank you. That was well played.
Good timing. So it's beginning to see that if we do it in thinking and it aligns with reality, there's going to be a beneficial experience that probably isn't going to be as dramatic and as conflicted and as much turmoil as this other thing that we think is so normal. And it's going to begin to actually dilute that and start to see, wow, I have been going to great lengths to make a mess and claim that I had nothing to do with it. No wonder it keeps getting worse. No wonder it spreads.
By having nothing to do with it, you mean like something's happening to you?
Exactly. They're just imagining that I'm making the mess, but I can't be making the mess. That's the same thing as thinking that what's happening shouldn't be happening. That what I'm doing isn't what I'm doing. That what they're doing isn't what they should be doing. While, as Arliss pointed out, if the guy thinks God is testing him, that's what the guy's thinking. I don't have to chew down on that to let him think what he's thinking, but I could also share with them that maybe what he's thinking about is what he's thinking and not what God's doing. Because God isn't a doer, God is a being. Beings are and humans do. Things do. Beings don't do, they just are. They're just essence. They're something in a level of consciousness that transcends the functional issues of a relative experience that we seem to be having. So if reality is real, John, and we simply contemplate that it may be real, and it may not be up to us to think about it, the experience our thinking has, and this somewhat counters what Arliss was talking about, if all I'm thinking is what I'm thinking and constantly thinking that thinking is only conflicted, all I'm thinking about is obsessive thinking as being all that thinking is, and not seeing that thinking's actual design is not to try to conclude reality and truth by believing in reality and truth,
Spanish bodeguero.
but simply beginning to express reality and truth as reality and truth. Because it would naturally flow through us. We would naturally know to do what we know to do rather than think about doing the only thing we think we can do. It's a big transition. And my experience is, through experience, that very often one of the ways we see that is to repetitively do something until we get really master it. And all of a sudden we start doing it without a lot of thinking. And we start seeing that thinking obstructs our ability to do it.
I like what you said about beings are and
things do, humans do.
Things to do.
Yeah.
But looks to me that we do both. We are, and at the same time we do.
Yes. But effectively, all we're doing within a being nature is creating an experience of something that is illusory because it's going to dissolve at some point. Our experience of it is going to dissolve, but our knowing nature has no dissolution because it's part of an ever-present absolute nature that is all-knowing. It doesn't need to think to be, and we don't need to think we are to be either. But we cause great havoc, as we have historically, making believe that all we are is what we think. But just to misuse.
I find like our knowing nature doesn't need a defense.
Well, it wouldn't help if it did.
Right.
There is no risk in something that's absolute, so there is no threat, there is no defensiveness, there is no posturing, there is no here and there is no this and then, none of that. Or there and then, it's all present. It's all just present awareness, knowing. And if that's actually our nature, then we've gone a long way to make believe it isn't. To even think that this would be preposterous or something exceptional and rare and hard to find shows how thoroughly we have engulfed ourselves in stories and cultures and mores and creeds and rules and regs that are not anything other than thoughts, limitations, thoughts that aren't true.
I just find that people find comfort in like a punishing God. Like I have dialogue with these two guys that are into the St. James version of the Bible, and I'm like water on a rock because they originally were kind of almost hostile towards me and my dialogue. And now they are more like big brothers that are just trying to lure me over because I'm not in their mind, because I don't believe in the rules and regs. I'm not going to go to heaven, but they like me now and will allow me, because I say, that in my experience, they thing is love. There's love and fear is talked about in the course, but that I believe that only love is real. And they're like, that's dangerous. And that I don't have the passion to like protect. Like I would just stand by while someone, stole my grandchild or ran over my daughter or something. I said, no, that's not what it is. I'm not complacent, nor do I think that it's okay or agree with things that are ugly, mean, or bad. I just don't hold on to the thought that there's rules and regulations, and if I don't do them in a certain way, I'm not going to go to heaven.
Well, you'll be in your natural hell if you do. So anything other than that would seem very heavenly. Just keep in mind, think of how clever it is that we can actually deny what we're doing and blame an infinite source like God as doing it. Think of that leap. This is the same exact thing as thinking what's happening isn't happening. That what I'm doing isn't what I'm doing. That what I'm thinking isn't what I'm doing. It's the exact same thing. It's using an excuse in the grandest possible scheme to simply disavow for the thinking I'm thinking about. Not what God's doing, not what some infinite spirit is doing, not what some loving source is doing, but what I'm doing. What is that? An attempt once more to blame, to victimize my own experience by thinking somebody else is responsible, by thinking I have no other choice, by thinking it's not me doing this. It's the exact nature of that obsessive thinking. And at its core, if it's looked at the core, it begins to be seen as something that infects all of our thinking whenever it has anything to do with any of our thinking. And so getting better is beginning to realize that I don't need to think of it at all for it to be. I don't need to think of it as what I think it is for it to be what it is. All of that starts to dissipate. And then all of a sudden, the intuitive nature allows me to start to express it in ways that I would never think of doing because it's not bound by the thinking I would be limited to, but starts to introduce to me things I would never think of. And that's a much more expansive, that's a healing because it doesn't create stress. It actually relieves stress. What I've found in my body is that a lot of the stress that I've maintained that's gone away has revealed the chemical toxicity that was loaded in the muscles that were tense. I got some stiffness recently and some pain in my knees and just took over. The doctors couldn't figure out what it was. And I realized that my legs had been so tight my whole life and so tense in my shoulder muscles that as that stuff started to go and relieve, and it's been considerably released the last couple of years, all that toxicity was held. My suspicion is it sort of spread through my system, got stuck in my joints, and there was a lot of buildup of chemicals that were being held at bay. Numbing things is a chance to isolate pain. Tension isolates pain, but it gets so tight that it can't continue. Just like we get so tight, we can't continue thinking the thinking we're doing. If pain is the touchstone of spiritual growth, this release of that chemical toxicity is the pain of the human functional capacities growth, our ability to heal our body and start to allow our bodies to function better. Now, I don't know that that's actually what's happening, but I've done my best to look at it in a way that would make some sense out of this, because my sense is that tension, my legs used to be so tense and they're not tense anymore, was being held at bay. And I thought my legs were stronger than they are, but it wasn't muscles, it was stiffness that I was relying on. And now that they're looser, I expect they're probably not as strong, but now I can actually build the muscle rather than use tension to define the muscle and to restrict the muscle and to constrict the muscle and feel stronger when in fact it was actually just masking stiffness and constraint and tension in my muscles. And my shoulders were like that too. My neck was seriously tight, and I can move freely. I was moving my shoulders for a while and my neck moves differently. And it largely started when we all started talking about this on a broader level than the one-on-one I'd done for years.
The release started, or the tension started and now the release is happening?
No, the release started because I started to function in a way that was more inclusive rather than exclusive.
Yeah.
My sense was when I had the conversation with the group, I could see that some people would sit back and be frustrated because normally these conversations within sobriety are done one-on-one. And often in meetings, there's rules about what to say, what not to say, don't talk about other people's shares, all that kind of stuff. So there's not a lot of interaction there. We can comment, but it's so low comments. And yet in the dynamic of our days, we're generally amongst people in all walks of life saying and thinking all sorts of things. And it seemed to me this practice would be more useful if we had this conversation together and started noticing that this can be applied in our daily basis. And I would say everyone is somehow, in one way or another, applied it in some way, because if you begin considering things that are accurate, whether they're truthful or absolute in any way is irrelevant. If you're approaching them and becoming more functional in your thinking, it's going to reveal things that are useful very quickly and reliable, that aren't doubtful and don't create uncertainty. You may notice your uncertainty better. You may notice your doubtful thoughts better because the clarity provides that. And that is, in fact, what sobriety is about, is getting sober from the greatest affliction to start noticing the more subtle affliction of the thinking we do about the thinking that causes the compulsions and the impulsions and the reactivity that gives us the sense that we need to avoid what's happening rather than embrace it and love it. And that includes what we think is hate. When I embrace the hate and start noticing that I have it for somebody, it puts it to an end, and I start seeing that I really only had it in a thought, and it had nothing to do with them and everything to do with what I was thinking. And I can see them. I noticed for years how quickly people in meetings would exceed my expectation when I thought nothing of them.
Yeah.
And I'd always feel a little embarrassed. I'm like, wow, they just said something. That was incredible. I really appreciate that. And I'd always go tell them that. I wouldn't tell them that the reason it impacted me is because I thought they were basically worthless.
They probably knew. There was a knowing awareness that.
Well, you're right. I mean, I suspect we all know it, because when we're thinking, our thinking is all that we value. We're valuing nothing of value. And that sense of worthlessness, unworthiness is common. You hear people talk about it a lot. Low self-esteem, feeling less than. Why would we feel more than if what we were doing is so much less than all we have? We're acting on impulses that are completely based in nothing other than thought. Thinking of itself. Wrong thought. Thought is right. Untrue thought. Thought is truth. The interesting thing is, it's always going to, that sort of thinking is always going to create the same depressing impression. And what I thought for years is if I got better managing it, I wouldn't feel it as much. When in fact, the management of it had me feel it more and more and more. And I became so desensitized, I didn't notice how bad I'd gotten until I realized my whole body was filled with tension.
Mm-hmm.
So attention paid to things that are actually happening, even if it's just noticing everything around you right now is happening as it's happening. And everything everyone's thinking right now is what they're thinking right now. I don't even have to wonder about it. I don't have to worry about it. I can actually concede it as something so general and become familiar with everything that's happening in a simple thought that isn't obstructed, that isn't overdeveloped, that isn't complicated, because I'm looking at things as simply as I can see them. If it's happening, it's happening. And if all that's happening is happening now, then everything that's happening is happening now with everybody who's doing anything right now. So we now know what everybody is doing everywhere anything's happening. We know what they're doing. We know that they're doing what they're doing. They're thinking what they're thinking. Things are doing what they're doing right now, everything. So that's that. Nothing else to think about. It's pretty simple.
It's not complicated or overdeveloped.
Well, any thought we have that simplicity isn't simple is going to complicate it. And every time we try to define it, complicates it, because the words aren't the thing. They're the words referencing the thing. And to think of the words as the thing has us go off on these launches that humans have done. Look at all the books that have been written trying to explain it all.
I think there's a discomfort in the simplicity of it, though. You know what I mean? Like, I think people feel that it has to be complicated to have value.
The discomfort isn't in the simplicity. It's in the clarity you get when you see the simplicity of the things you're doing that are discomforting.
The neutrality thing. I'm so into that neutrality thing and the responsibility, and it's so beautiful.
Well, but noticing from there, any of these things you're doing will feel discomforting if you're doing any of them. And you'll see those discomforting things you think you're not doing in the reactiveness. You know, what I realized is I had a lot of petty thoughts about people and things. I had a lot of expectations that were just naturally depressing. They weren't, this is going to go great. It was pretty much, this guy's going to blow it. This guy's never going to do what I would do. He's never going to live up to my expectations. And I started seeing that all that stuff was revealing these underlying thoughts that I thought I wasn't having, and yet they were impacting my experience. And still do to any degree I do. I mean, I do that daily.
I just think the freedom that my awareness has brought me, that I don't need to defend anymore, has brought me that neutrality, that peace. I don't feel like I have to defend anything at all.
All right. Well, keep your eyes open. See if you don't have a reactive here or there. You may. But listen, Jen, I appreciate that those experiences are so dramatic. They're so simple and so dramatic as to seem to put an end to the potential, because they're so far from what we used to experience. They're just so dramatically different. And it's kind of like getting sober. A lot of people in their first 6 months of sobriety think, oh, this is great. And all of a sudden, the real confrontation of what they're up against starts to occur to them. And then the work begins. Then the real work begins of being honest and looking clearly and starting to notice that any thought we have about anybody that has them as wrong is something we're thinking that's wrong. Because what they're doing is what they're doing. Whether it's right or wrong has nothing to do with us. It's their experience that they're impacting. When my experience is impacted by what they're doing, it's my thinking about what they're doing that's wrong.
My thoughts on somebody's wrongness is my expectation of them doing something that I want them to do. And that
Yes.
if it doesn't play out, then I can't be, I don't want to say happy, because I'm trying not to parade it, but that I'm holding my breath until a certain time and place to see if it plays out how my story wants it to play out. And that I don't know if it's necessarily an expectation, because it's almost less than that. It's a whole story, which is just not real at all. And that I can't have my peaceful neutrality if they don't do it my way.
Well, do not underestimate the impression that is made on our experience by creating delusions and living with them. It feels real because it's happening. It's depressing because it's happening. It's not because the thing we're thinking about is reality. It's because we're thinking it's real that it has that depressing effect.
Right.
That's it. So
Right.
I would say you're actually seeing your expectations in thinking that what they should do should be closer to what you think rather than what they do. I can assure you, if you begin to have the expectation that everything is going to happen as it happens, you'll never have an expectation dashed again. And you'll be open to everything that happens. And as a result, you will be interactive with it and responsive to it in a way, which I'm sure you're doing now because I've witnessed what you've gone through. You will be interacting with it in a way that is beneficial and useful and gainful and exciting. Not even exciting, it's more fulfilling. It's satisfying. There's an awareness that you're learning in the process and that you're growing in the process, and that it's providing the opportunity for you to notice subtle things that you might not think you're doing that will always be happening to any degree that we have any thought that is incorrect and think it's correct. It's so subtle, this whole shift, that the idea that we've done it so long it becomes so difficult isn't true, because all it is the thought we're having now about all those things we've ever done that we're struggling with. We use a history that we maintain in our own thinking right now to justify it's hard to undo, when in fact it's hard to keep that thought alive because it's nothing more than conjecture.
Yeah, the subtlety of it, I don't want to say makes me want to, but because of those things I hold it historically, I want to complicate things. I want to cause chaos. I want to create the deep. Okay, so my example, even though it's a story and it's not real, is that my friend is supposed to come over for my birthday. It's going to be my 65th birthday, and it's kind of a big deal. And every dialogue we have is like, it's 38 days, it's 37 days. And then yesterday I said, why are we even doing to myself? It's like I'm setting myself up for a disappointment, or I have an expectation that doesn't need to be, because so say it doesn't happen. Am I going to be all bummed out? No, I should just be happy that I'm alive, that I'm breathing in and out, that what's happening is happening. And I feel like it's dissolving into that. Like now I feel like when we have the dialogue of the 30 whatever days, I kind of find it amusing at this point. So I think it's good. I think things are I'm becoming less reactive and less expective. I don't have, like, I'm not going to hold my breath for the next 35 days or whatever. And that if this parade that we've been creating, our story, doesn't happen, I'm going to be totally bummed out and shut down and cut them off because it didn't happen. I feel like it's getting healthier. Somehow it's dissolving into a more neutral position of that what is.
Well, it sounds to me like you're bringing balance to the thoughts as you see the imbalanced thought.
Right.
So part of the ultimate awareness here, I would say the end goal, the end run, is starting to just notice, wow, I'm still having these thoughts.
Right.
These
And
thoughts.
I want to create them when they're not there. I want to create the chaos because it's familiar.
Well, you also want to justify doing what you're doing and try to say that it's something you can't wait to do when in fact it's probably damning you in some way you don't want to admit. Right? There's a thrill to it because we get a release of these chemicals in our system.
Absolutely. And I'm kind of looking forward to it not happening the way I want it to happen so that I can be a victim somehow.
So here's something to play with. The cycle only turns us into a victim when we think it's happening to us, right? If we're doing it, you can begin to do these things and embrace it and say, wow, I'm having this thought. I'm going to act on this thought voluntarily. I'm just going to act on it. I'm going to act out the way I normally would. I'm going to try to feel better about it. I'm going to try to think of other things I could be thinking. I'm going to try to bring balance to it. Or I'm going to fight it. I'm just going to fight this thought. And you'll start seeing that even in the doing of it, you'll start thinking, what the fuck am I thinking? What am I doing? This makes no sense.
That's what's happening. That's the dissolving part. My awareness is being brought, or my awareness is becoming apparent to me that, I'm finding it kind of amusing, which I think is a healthy thing. It's a good thing. I'm more aware that it isn't a parade. There's more neutrality.
When it's dramatic, it's never funny. And when it's honest, it's always funny that we would take ourselves so seriously as to make believe that we should kill ourselves over the seriousness of something that has that's a joke.
I haven't totally gone to the kill myself, but I have gone to the point where I have a few co-conspirators that definitely, if it doesn't play out because there are other women and the four of us all think it should be this little parade, and that if it doesn't, that whole experience is going to be ruined. And now, luckily, I'm finding that it's dissolving and it's sort of amusing and it's not painful. It's all beautiful.
So reactive, impulsive, and compulsive behaviors are all suicidal tendencies because they're all fighting for something that doesn't exist. In every case, they're fighting for a thought that we think is true, that reality doesn't need defense, as you said earlier, I think. Doesn't need any defense because it doesn't have any risk. There is no threat to reality and truth. If something is absolute, there's no threat, there's no risk, there is no defense. What would it defend? It would be useless. Why is the uselessness of our defense useless? Because we're trying to defend something that doesn't exist, as though it exists.
Right. That's exactly right. You're defending a story that's an illusion.
Even if it's just an illusion, as reality is delusional.
Mm-hmm.
A mirage has never satisfied anyone's quench or thirst or need to get out of the Sahara Desert. Right? But wasn't it interesting that most of the mirages, what did they have? Only what people desperately needed: shade and water.
Mm.
They didn't see a guy in the distance with a barbecue out in the open sun or with a hot, they saw what they needed. What do we need? To imagine that reality and truth is ours by continuing to imagine within the narrative we develop, someday it will be true if I keep thinking about it. It will never be true. But what the irony of this is that one of the greatest things we have as a species is the ability to create and innovate. And we turn that against our own best interest by creating and innovating things that always seem to have caustic consequences. Consistently through history, we've created great things that we've said, here's the answer. And in some time, you realize this has been the problem. Food's been one of those things. All those things that they developed during the 40s and 50s and 60s and all that are now being seen as one of the major causes of cancer and all kinds of other. They're all processed and filled with chemicals. And what is a body going to do when it gets fed poison? But be poisoned. It took 50 years from the 60s when they started talking about organic farming and communes and all that stuff for stores to actually be renamed Whole Foods. Because we've been eating half food for years.
Well, and just the notion that I, as a human, would have more or less value if this parade happens. You know what I mean? Like I would be more attractive or more worthy or more valuable because this thing, these people come over and we do the thing, and then I get to tell you that, oh, so-and-so came over and we had this marvelous time. And if so-and-so doesn't come over, that makes me less than. It's insane. And the beauty of it is in the awareness of it, and that it's not weighty or painful or ugly. It's just an awareness, and it's like bringing balance. It's a neutrality, and it's so lovely.
Think of light in relation to your description. Light is light. There's no weight to it.
Right.
It's also bright.
It's such a freedom. It's such a freedom. This whole neutrality thing is such a huge gift. It just is so beautiful.
I appreciate this, all of you. It's been a good conversation today, and I want to obviously continue. And those of us who are going to walk are doing it also to try to begin to create sort of an outline of bullet points and things that people could read through and consider and contemplate either during the week or in between listening to whatever we do here, and start to address this on a more public level that could be disseminated and discussed in a broader way. My sense is if this is accurate about something humans have been doing, humans would broadly benefit from this discussion. And that is my aim. And I love being involved in this because it's constantly confronting me with the limitations I maintain and the ideas I have that aren't true, and constantly giving me a chance to think in ways that go beyond those limits and start to see that those limits are just self-imposed. They don't really even exist. To say I'm going beyond them is to suggest they're actually real. You know, just like saying we're getting over something. It's like a dead body in the road. You got to climb over. It's not there. It's like thinking my life depends on it means I really believe that this thing I call myself has a life, like it's breathing. It has no substance other than thought. And if thought thinking of itself is all that it is, then what is it? But nothing in relation to reality and truth, simply a thought serving itself. Thoughts thinking about thoughts serve themselves. What do? Create more and more thoughts. They don't create reality and truth. They don't create who I am, who we are, what we are. They just create more thoughts. That would be a pretty good definition of obsessive thinking. The more I do, the more I get. And what do I get? A bigger mess. What do I want to do? Blame, shame, fault everyone else. Why? Because I'm the blame. I'm to fault. I'm the one that feels the shame because I'm ashamed for what I know I'm doing wrong. Thanks for joining. Let's continue. Love you guys. It's good to see you all.
Mahalos. Aloha.
Yes.
Gracias. Thanks, Jeff.
Thanks. Say hi to Dee Dee and MK to Anna.
Thank you. Have a good one.
You got it.